Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Third Place podcast. The name of this episode is A Matter of Priorities, and I think it's an appropriate name mostly because one of the biggest reasons, in my opinion, for the disappearing of the third place is the fact that people have other things to do in life. They have other priorities. You have the first two places, which are, of course, to many more important than the third place because the first one is, of course, the family, the second one is work, and the third one is just perceived as a socialization locale. Now, that's great, and in my opinion, that's how it should be. However, I think that we've kind of, as a society, went completely in the direction of total neglect of the third place. Um, because while, yes, it's true that the economy is getting worse and people are getting second, even third jobs, working overtime to provide for their families, um, just to be able to live in this world, it does make sense that they're gonna spend more time at work and so on. But the issue is we're not really perceiving the third place as a place of opportunity. We're not perceiving the third place as a way to actually improve our lives. And this matter of perceived value is probably why it's kind of lagged behind the other two places um, to drastic proportions. I don't know if that's something that we can recover very fairly quickly, but I do think that it's possible to do it over time. It just requires some action. Now, this idea of perceived value, like I mentioned, is something that it makes sense logically. If you go to work, you're gonna get paid. If you're home, of course, you're spending quality time with your family. Um, but it's not, I think, wise to kind of forget about the opportunities that exist in one's community, or that could exist in one's community, if such a community even exists. Because a lot of the time, these opportunities are not always available online. They're not available even through one's own professional or even direct personal network, right? Um, I would say imagine something like a better society where we did have these communities, these third places everywhere. And you kind of walk into your local third place, and let's say you're looking for another job, right? You mention it to the people that you know there, and then they connect you to either someone that's already there or someone that they know, um, that may potentially be looking for a new employee in that particular discipline. But the idea is that these places, especially if it's a heavier concentration of people, increase these opportunities. I'm not saying that people should or communities should resort to nepotism. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that there's a certain level of trust, of course, with people that you see regularly, or at the very least that are part of your community. They know who you are, um, and they could, at the very least, vouch for you and land you an interview. Yes, you should still be the most qualified candidate for the position, but the point is that these particular um, locales kind of could serve as the places where opportunity could be um, at least provided to that degree. I think that most people would most probably agree that third places could be valuable. However, the issue is that not a lot of people want to invest in growing these communities, these third places, without actually seeing more of an instant gratification, a return of that investment as soon as possible, right? In today's society, we're kind of conditioned to receive rewards, instant gratification, right? Very, very quickly. Um, but unfortunately, that's not really how it was for most of human history. And it's not something that should be looked in every single situation, every single context. Sometimes some things take time in order to manifest, so to speak. Um, but people don't seem to see it that way, right? People seem to kind of want things right away, and nobody really wants to invest into these third places, with the chance that they might not get a return on investment. If even if something um, as small as half an hour a week were to be put into these third places, in a duration of a year, if an entire community did that, that could be great. Imagine all the conversations that could be happening. However, yes, there are some barriers to entry when it comes to this. I agree, but they're not as great, right? It's just that if you look at things like getting to the location, that's a cost. Yes, you have to pay for gas. It takes time to do that, and people do often think, well, am I actually going to get something out of this conversation? And this is, I think, where the wisdom comes in. If you go and expect to get something out of one or two conversations, chances are you're not going to get anything out of it. You actually need to build relationships with people in your community over a longer period of time, right? And a community is not created with one-off events, once in a blue moon type events. These events have to be whether it's an event or it's irregular gatherings, these have to be, like I said, regular, frequent, at least on a weekly basis. And it takes time. Yes, there is a cost to it, but people kind of have to get over that in a way, and um, be wise to the fact that it's a long-term investment. That if you actually do invest in your community with the hours of going there, just being present, having conversations, that eventually something, as the community grows, something could come out of it. There is another important idea that should be covered here, and that's the notion of individualism versus collectivism, or rather, what's perceived as more important to a person. And I would say to most people, at least the ones living in the West, the individual prosperity is more important than the collective good. And yes, people should have the freedom, the ability to pursue that. Um, but at the same time, I don't think that people should be that level of closed off to each other and kind of refuse to work together towards something greater. I think that that's something that needs to kind of revive in a way. The idea of a collective mission. And a lot of the times, this is, in my opinion, what's missing in society. It's people working together towards a collective mission. Um, I understand, a lot of people probably feel burned by collective actions, by collective work from the past. And this doesn't mean that people should give their power away. Um, Definitely not. It should be a free choice, but within that free choice, those that seek wisdom should probably considered the idea of working together um, for something greater than themselves. And this doesn't have to be, divine. It could be, not talked about something spiritual necessarily. This is as varied as there are people on the planet. This can just be as simple as let's make our neighborhood more affluent or something, right? But, you know, back to the previous point, people don't really seem to kind of think of like that nowadays. So, if, well, I will also benefit from the collective. Um, and that's unfortunate because it's true, everyone does benefit from it, including the person who invests into this. Now, I would like to turn to literature and academia to see what authors who have worked in this space have said about ideas related to what we've been talking about here today. Naturally, it's a good point to begin with Ray Oldenburg, the actual person who coined the term the third place in his 1989 book, The Great Good Place, in which he discusses this idea of the third place itself. However, what I want to focus on more specifically is how Oldenburg actually talks about this uh, notion of the third place and how it relates to priorities. Well, Oldenburg actually talks about the idea of voluntary presence at these locations, whether it's a local cafe, bar, or anything else that represents a community's local meeting point. He does make a point that they are voluntary um, meetups. People on their own will go there, which means they must have seen value in doing so. Um, Something that's related. One of his other points is that these were regular hangout spots, regular meetups, meaning people in the community would regularly come to these third places in order to socialize, converse, and whatnot. Um, which is very interesting because that might be because people in the past have perceived the third place as more valuable then, or maybe our perception has changed. Maybe the inherent value of it has remained, has stayed the same, but maybe it's just us, this modern generation, that are seeing it as not valuable. um these third places, Oldenburg also says, were centered on conversation, right? If you kind of compare that to nowadays, of course, there are still cafes, there are still third places, so to speak. At least from a venue, from a locale point of view, there are these businesses that actually serve drinks and whatnot. But it doesn't really, from my own personal experience as well, it doesn't really seem that people actually go there to talk to people within their community. You just go there usually nowadays with your own friend group or by yourself. You go to coffee shops and you see those people working on their laptops. So it doesn't really represent an opportunity anymore to meet new people, to socialize in the greater community. It's just these like closed off little circles of people, which is not how it used to be. Yeah, even if you didn't know someone, someone from the community would introduce you, a mutual acquaintance or friend would introduce you to other people there. Um, and this kind of ties into Oldenburg's other points that it used to be accessible. Nowadays, the fact that people are kind of, I don't want to say excluded, but if you're not part of the existing circle, even if there's like a regular certain venue, like a cafe, let's say, it's not accessible to most people unless you're in already. Um, that's not how you foster community, right? And that's, Oldenburg talked about the idea of community a lot, of course. Um, and this is kind of why I'm trying to tie it into what we're talking about today, right? The priorities. And why is this important? Because you look at the fact that people would go regularly to these things, right? They would go, I don't know what frequency, might have been daily, weekly, or whatnot, but they were more certainly regular. And they would, in short words, they made it a priority to do so, right? Um, that's the difference between the previous generations and us, right? They prioritized that particular thing, maybe just for the sake of conversation, even if it's not anything, economic or anything beyond that. It's just for the sake of the conversation. They prioritize conversation. Um, and that might be an art that we've lost. That might be a value that we've lost as well. Now, this question of why the modern generations aren't prioritized in the third place is not a recent phenomenon. It's been explored by various authors, researchers over the decades of the latter half of the entire 20th century. Um, the next one that I would like to discuss that relates to this is an author by the name of Robert Putnam, who wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And in this book, he talks about several related ideas, notions. The first being the idea of social capital. Now, when Putnam talks about the idea of social capital, he isn't just talking about friendships. He's talking about all sorts of relationships that may eventually benefit a person in a community. That may be during the job seeking process, that may be when borrowing tools from neighbors, that may be all sorts of things, but it's just the idea of being able to leverage a relationship in order to receive personal benefit. And that this is important when it relates to our discussion, because if you don't have a community, right? If you don't have the idea of cultivating relationship, again, not necessarily close friendships only, but relationships within a community, a person almost kind of shoots themselves in the foot by kind of cutting themselves off from potential opportunities and benefits that will make their life easier. He kind of criticizes the invention of the television, because this was published a while back when the television was the big thing. Obviously, nowadays, this would include other entertainment platforms as well. Another great point that Putnam makes is that trust is cumulative, meaning one has to repeatedly attend a certain venue, a certain community, in order for the other members of the community to increase their trust in that person. Um, the less people go there, the less trust people have in each other. And this is kind of like a self enforcing prophecy, so to speak. It's cyclical in the sense that less people go there, less trust, and this lower trust leads to lowered attendance in the community, and it just kind of spirals down until the community is dead. Um, that's the negative effect of it. But to counter that, of course, people would actually have to attend their local community, their local third place regularly, and build that trust over time, not attend once in a blue moon events, once in a blue moon occurrences, hoping that their community is going to trust them, that these opportunities are magically going to be given to them just because they went there once. This is, I believe, very relevant to many communities nowadays, um, because if people don't attend, they don't really know each other, they don't really trust each other, so why would they help each other? So that's an important food for thought. A particularly interesting publication that I think we should explore is one called The Strength of Weak Ties, written by an author called Mark Granovetter. And this one is interesting to look at because the author talks about um, the notions of strong and weak ties, strong being relationships such as close family members, close friends, people that we interact with on a daily basis, so to speak. Whereas weak ties are people um, more distant to us relationship wise. And we would assume in our everyday kind of life, that our closer relationship, our stronger ties would be the ones who would help us the most with our opportunities. While the author here, Granovetter, argues something completely opposite. He's saying that uh, a lot of opportunities actually come from weak ties, from people that we don't particularly have a strong level of closeness with. Um, and this is the idea of bridging networks, meaning that a lot of strong ties people have overlapping networks. They know each other, they know a lot about each other, they interact with mostly the same people. And if there's any opportunities there, they've probably, I guess, been already exhausted, quote unquote. But when you look at people who one may not necessarily be directly connected with, you're creating this bridge between your network and theirs. So it's much more likely that once those two networks come into contact, that there will be plenty more opportunities, right? Because they've never interacted, right? You suppose you join a soccer team. Let's say you start meeting all these new people that you've never met before, and now suddenly their network, right? Their family, their friends, their neighbors, as well as yours, um, are bridged by the two of you, right? Let's say your cousin is an accountant, and your soccer your new soccer buddy is now looking for an accounting job, just hypothetically speaking. This is an opportunity that didn't exist within his respective network, but now knowing you, who in that context is a weak tie to him, now you've connected this person to an opportunity that no longer existed. And this is the core, the center of the author's argument, that these opportunities actually usually come from people that we don't interact with, which really beautifully ties into what we've been talking about here today. Um, and the idea of how important it is to prioritize, at least in my opinion, third places, local communities, because through these local communities you find a lot of weak ties. A lot of people in the community are not people that you are direct friends with. They're not your relatives, most likely. So it serves an opportunity for everyone to kind of step into each other's network, so to speak, and really it can help everyone, but it just requires people's participation. It requires, like we talked about so far in this episode, um, consistency, regular meetups, and ultimately the valuation of things that we've kind of over time stopped valuing. I would like to thank you in joining me today in this first episode of the Third Place podcast. Um, this is something that's very new to me. There is a bit of a learning curve, of course. You have to learn how to work new equipment. You have to learn how to pace yourself along with other things. And thank you for bearing with me while I kind of get the hang of it. I do plan on releasing different episodes, which eventually will feature different individuals as well, guests who are um, leaders in their own communities, who are organizers of communities of events that can offer their own perspectives on different matters. So until such time, I will once again like to thank you for joining me. Uh, I would very much appreciate it if you could like this video, subscribe to the channel, comment if possible to help the algorithm. You know,
Sell me your soul.
just kidding, just kidding. See you next time on the Third Place Podcast.